May 3, 1945. A few minutes before midnight, off the west coast of Okinawa, several hundred Japanese soldiers of the 26th Shipping Engineer Regiment are crossing dark water in barges, motorboats, and native canoes. Their orders are to land behind the American lines near the village of Kuwan, cut into the rear of the 1st Marine Division, and tear open the flank of the entire American front. They are moving at night because moving at night is what the Japanese army does. It is what the Japanese army has always done. Every man in those boats has been trained since his first year of service to believe that darkness belongs to Japan, that it is the 1 hour of the day no amount of American steel can take away from him. The boats are perhaps a few hundred yards from shore when the first star shell bursts above them. Then another, then a dozen more. Naval illumination rounds, fired on call from destroyers and gunboats that have been waiting offshore all night for exactly this, ignite one after another and drift down on parachutes, each one burning with the intensity of a small sun. The sea turns white. The boats, the paddles, the packed men, the demolition charges lashed to the gunwales, all of it is suddenly visible from one end of the anchorage to the other, thrown into a glare so total that men later said it felt like midday had been switched on by hand. Ships' searchlights swing across the water and pin individual barges in their beams, holding them there while the guns find the range. And then the guns open. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. By dawn on May 4th, the counter-landing force is gone. The Marines and the armored amphibian crews along that stretch of coast count hundreds of Japanese dead, in the surf and on the seawall, boats splintered and burning at the tide line, weapons and demolition charges scattered across sand that had been empty and dark 6 hours earlier. A matching attempt on the east coast, aimed at the rear of the 7th Infantry Division, ends the same way, caught in the light and destroyed before it can organize on the beach at all. The soldiers in those boats had done everything their doctrine asked of them. They had waited for darkness, trained their whole careers to trust it, and crossed the water the moment it fell. The darkness had simply stopped existing. On command, from ships they never got close enough to see. This script is a forensic examination of that fact, of how the Japanese army arrived at Okinawa in 1945, carrying a 40-year-old faith in the night, of how the Americans arrived with a machine built specifically to abolish it, and of what happened to the minds of 100,000 defenders when the one condition their entire tactical system depended on was switched off, night after night, for 82 days. To understand what broke on Okinawa, you have to understand where the faith came from, because it was old, it was earned, and for most of the Army's modern history, it had been correct. This was not superstition dressed up as strategy. It was a doctrine built on real victories, refined across 2 generations of officers who had watched it work, and taught to every recruit as settled fact rather than theory. The Imperial Japanese Army's attachment to night combat went back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. At Port Arthur, Japanese infantry took fortified Russian positions in brutal night assaults, wave after wave going forward under cover of darkness against machine guns and searchlights the Russians had never learned to use in coordination. The cost was appalling by any measure, tens of thousands of casualties in the siege as a whole. But the army that survived it did not conclude that night attack was too expensive. It concluded the opposite, that darkness had let a technologically weaker Japan close with a materially stronger Russia, on terms where courage and discipline outweighed artillery. And that lesson was carved into training manuals for the next 4 decades as something close to doctrine handed down from scripture. The qualities the army decided night attack rewarded were exactly the qualities it believed it possessed, in greater measure than any rival army on earth: discipline, aggression, a willingness to close to the bayonet without hesitating, and a tolerance for confusion and casualties that no Western army was thought to share. A materially superior enemy could not use his artillery effectively against attackers he could not see. His machine guns could not range on shadows moving through elephant grass or rice paddies. In the dark, the fight came down to nerve at arm's length, and Japanese doctrine held as an article of faith, repeated in academy lecture halls from the 1910s onward, that no soldier on earth matched the Japanese soldier at arm's length. Through the 1930s in China, and through the first 3 years of the Pacific War that followed, the Army practiced exactly what it preached, and largely got away with it. Night infiltration, night assault, night resupply. Entire regiments moving along jungle trails after sunset, when aircraft overhead were blind and naval gunfire had nothing to aim at. American veterans of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Peleliu, and Leyte all described the same nightly rhythm, told the same way in memoir after memoir, until it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like weather. The day belonged to American aircraft and artillery, and daylight movement on either island chain was close to suicidal for the Japanese. The night belonged to the enemy. After sunset, Japanese units moved forward under cover, dug new positions the Americans hadn't mapped, probed the wire looking for a gap, slipped individual infiltrators past sentries into the rear areas to cut throats and steal rations, and launched their set-piece attacks in the small, cold hours, when tired men on watch were most likely to blink at the wrong moment. It worked often enough, at Guadalcanal's Bloody Ridge and at a dozen nameless perimeters afterward, that both sides came to treat it as something close to a law of the theater rather than a tactic that might one day be countered, studied, and switched off. The Japanese soldier crossing the water off Kuwan on the night of May 3rd believed, with good reason built on 40 years of his army's own history, that he was doing the one thing that had never yet failed him. Nothing in his training, his orders, or his officers' own confident briefings had prepared him for the possibility that an enemy might simply decide to turn the night into day, on schedule, at will, from ships he would never live long enough to see. By early 1945, the Japanese officers planning the defense of Okinawa had no illusions about daylight. The 32nd Army's senior operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, was one of the most clear-eyed staff officers in the entire Japanese military, and he understood precisely what American firepower did to Japanese troops caught moving in the open under an observed sky. His answer was a strategy of attrition. Dig the army into the coral and limestone of southern Okinawa, into caves and tunnels and reverse slope positions around the ancient castle town of Shuri, and make the Americans pay for every ridge with blood and time, rather than meet them in the kind of open engagement daylight firepower always won. Above him sat two men of a different temperament, and the friction between them would shape the whole campaign. The army commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, dignified, respected, and inclined to delegate the details of the fight to the men under him. And the Chief of Staff, Major General Isamu Cho, a hard-drinking ultra-nationalist who believed with his whole chest in the offensive spirit, in the decisive stroke, in the attack, and who would spend much of the campaign arguing Yahara out of his own strategy. But whichever school won the argument on any given week, attrition or attack, both schools rested on the same load-bearing assumption, one so basic that neither man ever bothered to defend it out loud. Whatever the 32nd Army did, it would do in the dark. Supplies would move at night, carried up from depots in the rear, along paths scouted in daylight and walked in darkness. Reliefs and repositioning would happen at night, entire battalions shifting between cave systems while American observers slept or watched an empty ridge. Counterattacks would form up and step off at night, out of caves that had absorbed a full day of naval gunfire without losing a man. The caves protected the army from American shells by day. The night was supposed to give it back its freedom of movement, the one asset daylight could never take from it. Daylight belonged to the Americans, and darkness belonged to Japan, and an army that could not survive the first could still function because of the second. The 32nd Army had roughly 100,000 men, a formidable artillery park by Japanese standards, and the most sophisticated defensive works American forces would encounter in the entire Pacific War, built over the better part of a year by men who understood fortification. What it did not have, what it could not have known it needed, was a plan for an enemy who had decided that the sun was no longer going to set on schedule at all. The American force that landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, brought with it something that does not show up in most orders of battle, because it was distributed across hundreds of ships, and dozens of units, and thousands of men, whose job titles sounded like housekeeping rather than combat power. Call it the illumination machine. Its heaviest component sat offshore. The invasion fleet numbered over 1,300 ships, and among them, every single night of the campaign, specific destroyers, cruisers, and gunboats were assigned as fire support and illumination ships, parked off designated sectors of the line, with their charts gridded and their magazines stocked with star shells, before the sun went down. A star shell is a simple, unglamorous piece of ordnance. Nothing like the radar sets or proximity fuses that made headlines after the war. It is a projectile that bursts at altitude and releases a magnesium flare on a parachute, burning at hundreds of thousands of candle power as it drifts slowly down toward the ridgelines. One shell lights a battlefield for perhaps half a minute. The American system was never about one shell. Infantry units ashore could call for illumination by radio, the way they called for high explosive, and the ships would fire it on demand, all night, every night, shell after shell, timed so that as one flare guttered out over a draw or a ridgeline, the next was already blooming above it before the dark had time to return. Regimental after-action reports from Okinawa describe entire sectors kept under continuous illumination from dusk to dawn without a gap. The United States Army's own official history of the campaign, Okinawa, the Last Battle, records flatly that naval star shells made large-scale Japanese night movement close to impossible along the front. Ashore, the machine had a second layer, closer to the ground and faster to respond than anything a ship offshore could manage. 60mm and 81mm mortars, along with the divisional artillery, all carried their own illumination rounds, so that a platoon leader who heard movement in front of his wire did not even need the Navy at all. He could have light hanging directly over his own position in under a minute, aimed exactly where his ears told him to put it. And behind the beaches stood a third layer, the searchlights themselves. Army anti-aircraft searchlight batteries came ashore in the first weeks, and went into position around the anchorages, the airfields, and the unloading beaches. Their primary trade was hunting Japanese aircraft in the night sky, locking onto raiders for the anti-aircraft guns during the near-nightly air attacks that harassed the fleet. But those same beams, and the searchlights mounted on ships riding at anchor, swept the water constantly. Okinawa was the campaign where the Japanese Navy's suicide motorboats, hundreds of them hidden in coves and inlets around the island, were supposed to gut the American anchorage in nighttime swarms. The Americans had captured or destroyed roughly 350 of the boats outright when they seized the Kerama Islands a week before the main landing. And the boats that remained came out at night anyway, into picket lines, patrol boats, and light they could not evade. A plywood speedboat with a depth charge lashed into its bow is a genuinely frightening weapon in the dark. Caught in a searchlight beam, it is simply a target moving in a straight line. Stack those three layers together: ships offshore, mortars and artillery on the line, searchlights over the anchorage, and you get the thing the Japanese soldiers on Okinawa actually experienced night after night. A battlefield where darkness was no longer a condition of nature, that governed both sides equally. It was a resource now, and the enemy controlled the entire supply. The Americans could produce daylight on demand, over any grid square on the island, for as long as the ammunition held out. And on an island supplied by the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled in the Pacific, the ammunition always held out. None of this was a secret weapon in the sense that radar or the atomic bomb had been. A flare is not sophisticated technology, and every army in the war owned some version of one. What was new was the scale, the responsiveness, and above all the doctrine behind it. The deliberate decision to treat illumination as a standing utility of the battlefield, rather than an occasional signal fired only when a sentry got nervous. By 1945, the Americans had spent 3 full years being hurt in the dark, on Guadalcanal, on Saipan, on Leyte, and they had done what the American military of that war did reliably, with pain of that kind. They treated it as data. The conclusion they drew was almost insultingly direct once somebody finally wrote it down. Japanese night tactics depend entirely on the presence of night. Remove the night, and the tactics have nothing left to work with. If you want a measure of how thoroughly that conclusion had been institutionalized by April of 1945, consider that American infantrymen came to regard the flares overhead as part of the ordinary landscape of the war, as unremarkable after a few weeks as the rain that never seemed to stop either. Veterans' accounts describe sleeping in 2-man foxholes under a sky that flickered and hissed with descending magnesium light until morning. 1 man awake, 1 asleep. The shadows of the parachute flares swinging slowly across the mud between them all night long. It was miserable duty, cold and wet and endless. It was also the sound and light of a system that was keeping them alive. If this kind of forensic history is worth your time, hit the like button now. It takes 1 second, and it is the single thing that keeps this channel visible to the people who care about getting the record right. Through April, the 32nd Army fought Yahara's war, and fought it well. The Shuri line held. American divisions bled for yards. But inside the headquarters cave beneath Shuri Castle, the pressure for an offensive was building, and its source was Isamu-cho. The staff argument that followed is one of the best documented command disputes of the Pacific War, because Yahara survived the campaign on Ushijima's direct order, and recorded it in his memoir, The Battle for Okinawa. Yahara argued that leaving the caves meant dying under American firepower for nothing. Cho argued that pure defense was slow suicide, and that one coordinated blow, timed with the massed kamikaze raids the Navy was throwing at the fleet, could shatter the American 10th Army. Ushijima sided with his chief of staff. The attack was set for the 4th of May. The plan leaned on darkness at every joint. Under cover of night, the artillery would come out of its caves to fire in the open for the first time in the campaign. Under cover of night, the 24th Division would move to its assault positions. And under cover of night, in the plan's most ambitious stroke, engineer and raiding units would make those amphibious hooks around both flanks. The boats on the west coast aimed behind the Marines. The boats on the east coast aimed behind the Army's 7th Division, so that when the frontal blow landed at dawn, the American rear would already be burning. You already know what happened to the boats. The star shells found them in the first hour. The searchlights held them, and the flanking forces died in the water and on the seawalls, without ever forming up as units. Several hundred men on the west coast alone. The east coast force fared no better. The most darkness-dependent element of the entire offensive was annihilated by illumination, before the offensive proper had even begun. The main attack followed at dawn, and through the days that followed, and it failed the way Yahara had predicted it would fail. The Japanese artillery, firing from the open, was located and smothered by counter-battery fire and naval guns. The assault infantry, caught moving above ground in daylight, and then caught again reorganizing at night under the flares, was cut apart. By the time Ushijima called it off, the 32nd Army had lost somewhere around 5,000 of its best remaining troops, plus dozens of irreplaceable guns, for no gain of any kind. Yahara records that Ushijima called him in afterward, and, with tears in his eyes, told him that from that point forward, the army would fight the war Yahara had wanted all along. It was a concession delivered roughly a month too late, over the bodies of the men who had proved the point. Strip the May offensive down to its mechanics, and one detail stands out above everything else. Every element of the plan that required concealment assumed the concealment would be provided by night. The barges, the artillery displacement, the assembly of the assault battalions. Not one element of the plan had an answer for the question of what happens if the night is not dark. The planners were not fools. Yahara, in particular, was among the most capable staff officers Japan produced. But the darkness assumption sat so deep in the Army's doctrine, so far below the level of conscious decision, that it functioned less like a plan and more like a belief about how the physical world works. The Americans had falsified it, and the 32nd Army found out by experiment. The May offensive is the dramatic set piece. But the deeper story of illumination on Okinawa is quieter, longer, and crueler. Because the flares did their most important work on the 90-plus nights, when there was no offensive at all. Consider the ordinary logistics of the 32nd Army after the front stabilized. The Army lived underground by day, out of necessity. That meant everything an army needs to do above ground: carrying rations and water and ammunition forward, evacuating wounded, burying dead, relieving exhausted companies, repairing wire and positions. All of it was scheduled for the hours of darkness, because there were no other hours available. Now put continuous illumination over that schedule. Every carrying party that moved along a ridgeline did so knowing that at any second a flare could bloom overhead and freeze them in the open in front of registered machine guns. Prisoner interrogations and captured diaries from the campaign, summarized in the American official histories, return again and again to the same complaints. Movement between positions had become a gamble. Rations were not arriving. Wounded men could not be carried out. Units ordered to shift at night arrived late, scattered, or never. The army was not merely being shelled, it was being administratively strangled. because the 8 hours in which it had planned to do all of its living had been taken away. Then there is the layer below logistics, the psychological layer. And here the searchlights and flares were doing something to the Japanese soldier that artillery alone never quite did. A soldier under bombardment in a deep cave is in danger, but he is hidden, and being hidden is a form of psychological shelter as much as a physical one. Illumination attacked the hiddenness itself. Men wrote of the flare light in their diaries, the way soldiers usually write about cold or hunger, as a persistent condition that wears the nerves smooth. The light meant you were potentially seen at all times. It turned every night task into a performance in front of an audience of guns. Japanese infantry had been told for their entire service that the night was the time when the initiative passed to them, when the American soldier, soft, mechanized, dependent on his machines, huddled in his hole and waited in fear for dawn. On Okinawa, the roles ran in reverse. It was the Japanese soldier who came to dread the darkness hours, because darkness was when he had to go outside, and outside there was no darkness. The infiltration tactics that had terrorized American perimeters since 1942 did not disappear on Okinawa, but their yield collapsed. Small parties still crawled toward the wire with satchel charges. Under the flares, defending riflemen could actually see them, at range, in time. American accounts of the campaign are full of small nighttime fights that end with dead infiltrators on the wire, and no American casualties at all. Engagements that on Guadalcanal, 3 years earlier, would have been knife fights inside the perimeter. The exchange rate of the Japanese night attack, the one number that had justified 4 decades of doctrine, had inverted. And offshore, the same inversion played out in the air and on the water. The great kamikaze operations, the Kikusui raids that came in 10-mast waves across the campaign, leaned heavily on dusk and darkness to get through the fighter screens. The night raiders that survived the radar pickets and the night fighters arrived over an anchorage laced with searchlight beams and proximity-fuzzed anti-aircraft fire. The suicide boats that were supposed to swarm the transports at night were hunted in the beams and sunk in 1s and 2s. The kamikazes still did terrible damage in that campaign, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of American sailors. And nothing in this script should minimize that. But the specifically nocturnal component of the Japanese plan, the part that assumed darkness would neutralize American gunnery and American eyes, failed at sea for the same reason it failed ashore. By June, the 32nd Army was retreating south from the broken Shuri line, and even the retreat, the one operation armies most need darkness for, had to run the gauntlet of the flares. The army that had inherited Port Arthur, the army whose manuals had promised its soldiers that the night was a Japanese possession, ended the campaign unable to move a company after sunset without asking the enemy's permission, and the enemy never granted it. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served on Okinawa, in the infantry, on the gun crews, on the ships of the radar picket line, or in one of the searchlight and illumination units this story is really about, I would be honored to read their account in the comments. What unit were they with? Did they ever talk about the flares, the night attacks, the light hanging over the ridges until dawn? Those first-hand fragments matter more than any archive summary, and they belong in the record. Please share them. Okinawa was declared secure on June 22, 1945. Ushijima and Cho died by ritual suicide at the mouth of their final command cave that same morning. Yahara, ordered by his commander to live, to escape and tell the army's story, was captured, survived, and eventually wrote the memoir that lets us see the campaign from inside the Japanese headquarters. On the American side, the campaign's cost was appalling. Around 12,500 Americans dead, some 49,000 total casualties. Among them, the 10th Army's own commander, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., killed by artillery fire on June 18th. The most senior American officer lost to enemy fire in the entire war. Japanese military dead exceeded 100,000, and Okinawan civilian deaths likely reached a similar, unbearable figure. Nothing about the campaign was cheap, and nothing about the American victory was foreordained. But within that enormous battle sits the specific, measurable failure this script has been auditing, and the verdict on it can be stated plainly. The Japanese Army's night doctrine failed on Okinawa because it mistook a temporary condition for a permanent law. For 40 years, darkness had degraded the firepower of Japan's enemies more than it degraded Japanese infantry skill. and so darkness functioned as a Japanese weapon. The doctrine writers treated that relationship as a fact of nature. It was actually a fact about technology, and technology moved. Darkness, at bottom, is an information condition. It is the absence of targeting data. The whole value of the Japanese night attack rested on the enemy not knowing where the attackers were. The American illumination system of 1945 was, in essence, an information weapon aimed at that exact dependency. Star shells and searchlights did not kill anyone by themselves. What they did was restore the targeting data, on demand, at scale, and once the data existed, the ordinary machinery of American firepower, the machinery the night was supposed to switch off, simply kept running around the clock. There is a genuine symmetry here with the other great reversals of the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal, radar took the night surface battle away from a Japanese navy that had trained for it for 15 years. On Okinawa, illumination took the night land battle away from a Japanese army that had trained for it for 40. In both cases, the losing side had built real, hard-won excellence on top of a single environmental assumption. And in both cases, the Americans attacked the assumption rather than the excellence. They did not try to out-infiltrate Japanese infantry in the dark. They abolished the dark and let the infiltrators be ordinary men, visible and outgunned. And in both cases, the instrument of the reversal was operated by people history has mostly declined to remember. Nobody makes films about illumination ships. The destroyer crews who stood offshore night after night feeding star shells into 5-inch guns on a schedule. The mortar crews thumping flare rounds over the wire at 2 in the morning. The searchlight battery crews on the beaches holding a beam steady on a diving aircraft, while every gun in the anchorage used their light to shoot. These men appear in the histories as a sentence, if they appear at all. Yet ask what single American capability did the most to break the specific plan the 32nd Army brought to Okinawa. The plan to live by night, move by night, and strike by night. And the honest answer is that it was the light. Unglamorous, continuous, industrial light, called in by radio and delivered like a utility, until an army raised on the promise that darkness was its birthright, spent its final campaign praying, without hope, for one truly black night. If this breakdown gave you something you did not have before, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach viewers who want the mechanics of history, the systems, and the assumptions, and what happens when the two collide. And subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the men who worked those guns and lights, and the men who died learning that the night had changed sides, deserve to be understood in full, and there is a great deal of this war still to examine. The soldiers of the 32nd Army believed the darkness would hide them, because for their entire professional lives it always had. The Americans turned night into day above their heads, and held it there, until the war ended. That is the whole verdict. The rest is detail, and the detail is where the truth lives.